Welcome back. So just a quick update. I've been having a great time for the last day and two-thirds. And it's been a fantastic opportunity to hear from the choir, speaking to the choir about using behavioral insights to improve public policy. And one of the unfortunate truths is that when we leave here, we will run into people who aren't part of the choir, who don't even like the song that we're singing. In order to prepare for that transition back to that world of some people not being true believers, we created this session to speak specifically to that issue. So with us is Kate Glazebrook, who's a principal advisor in the Behavioral Insights team. I never understand the British titles, but she's a very important person in the Behavioral Insights team. Okay, that's the way I understand it. And I know that because she's a graduate of the Harvard Kennedy School, and all of our graduates are very important people. Okay, so we have established that. And Kate will be interviewing our other guest, who is Cass Sunstein. Cass is one of those people who needs no introduction, but that's not going to keep me from giving him one. I've been around some version of this field for long enough. I've told so many different histories of the history of the field of behavioral decision research, behavioral insights. But before Cass, the story really ended with the fact that the field was really quite fantastic at documenting the systematic and predictable mistakes that people made, but the unfortunate conclusion that Baruch Fischoff published in '82, but we replicated so often, is, but we don't know what to do about these mistakes. And Nudge really provided us with our architecture of how to think about changing behavior in a fundamentally different way than the field had been working on for many, many decades before that. So it's truly a revolutionary contribution that Cass made with Dick Thaler. He's written other terrific books, Simpler, Why Nudge, The World According to Star Wars, and no, I have not read it, so I can't tell you even what it's about. He also served in the prior Obama administration, and he's one of the most thoughtful and nice human beings on our campus, and it's a delight to have you both here. Welcome.
Well, thank you, Max, for that very generous introduction. It's a great pleasure to be with Cass and with you all to talk a little bit more about how we talk about nudges. And before I get going with some questions, I'm going to mention that we've also got questions coming in through Twitter, so please send those through and Phil will pass them on to me. But we're going to do as much as we can to get you kind of up and speaking to Cass directly if you've got questions. So I've got a few pre-prepared and we're going to chat about that, but I'll try and leave some time toward the end for you to ask questions directly to him. So without further ado, I thought we'd start with a bit of a historical recap. And I was looking through some early articles in Politico on nudging. And I found one article by an academic from a respected institution that wrote about government's nudging in this way, and I quote, "This approach is a huge extension of government's role, one that is fraught with peril. It represents nothing less than a fundamental rethinking of the democratic system. Normally, democracy empowers government to be responsive to your preferences. But the reality is now quite the opposite, as the federal government employs manipulative psychology to bring about its desired outcomes, which are intentionally hidden from voters." Cass, how common do you think this view still is of nudging in the US government?
Not common. So I don't know where they found that person to write those sentences. It was probably an intergalactic search. So there is a view that there's something non-transparent about behaviorally informed approaches, but nothing could be further from the truth. The calorie labels, which are all over the world now, those are pretty transparent. Energy efficiency labels are quite transparent. If there's a guide to help you eat healthy, like the food plate in the United States, nothing could be more transparent than that. Default rules are hardly hidden. So transparency is the strong presumption, and in some domains, an irrebuttable presumption. The notion of manipulation deserves a lot of thought. It's a very important idea. There is such a thing as manipulation. We need to have an account of it, and then to think whether nudges fall within that category. At first glance, if you go to the store and it says that a refrigerator is going to cost this much to operate next year, that doesn't sound manipulative. It might be manipulative not to tell you how much it's going to cost to operate. If people are given a warning about a product that has risks associated with it, unless something is done with the warning to turn it manipulative, it's not manipulative as such. It could be argued default rules are manipulative because default rules are omnipresent. We'd have to have a pretty capacious definition of manipulation such that your cell phone is, just by virtue of the fact that there are default settings, is manipulating you. So I think that intergalactic search uncovered that person, but there aren't a lot of people who write sentences like that.
Okay, well, that's good to know. I'm sure I could find some people. We still see a lot of that in the media, but it does seem that the conversation has shifted. And we were just talking actually about, even the few short years of BX, how much the conversation seems to have changed. And we're just talking about the word nudge. 15 years ago, that was not a word that had a common understanding of what it was, nor behavioral insights 5 to 10 years ago, and yet we use these terms without defining them in popular media. So it definitely appears that there has been a change in the conversation.
I think so. I should say, notwithstanding my lack of warmth toward that sentence, for democratic societies to be emphatic on the need for governments to treat their citizens with respect and to be, honest and to take public input and to avoid manipulation, that's extremely important. So to get a kind of nervous reaction to any use of psychology, that's completely legitimate, and there's a burden on those involved in public policy to make sure that there's no transgression of, let's say, the norm of civic respect, which democracies and non-democracies owe their people.
Well, that's a great segue into some new research that you've been doing on cross-cultural perceptions of nudges, and some surprising results have come out of that. Are you willing to share a few of them with us?
Yes, so I have data now for the United States and for diverse European countries, including Hungary, Denmark, the United Kingdom, Germany, France, and Italy. And what seems to be emerging, to my surprise, is there's, at least across a wide range of nations, something like an international consensus on what's acceptable and what's not. I'll tell you what is acceptable. Choice-preserving approaches that take the form of education, warnings, information disclosure, and default rules. Strong majorities in essentially all the countries support those things so long as the relevant end is also supported. If it involves, for example, calorie labels or graphic warnings for cigarettes or automatic enrollment in savings plans, it's remarkable the extent to which people in diverse nations are supportive of those things. So I tested in the US 34 nudges, and basically the things that the US government has either done or been seriously contemplated, Democrats like them, Republicans like them, and independents like them. And in Europe, a party affiliation isn't really explaining much in terms of people's reactions in the variety of countries I mentioned. So the nudges that are not approved, there are two categories that are clear, and there's one that's murky. So far, this is research ongoing. People don't like it if the nudger has what they consider an illicit or illegitimate goal. So if the nudger is saying, we're going to presume that people are of a certain religious conviction unless they indicate otherwise, people hate that, even if that's their own religious conviction. Now, you may be able to find countries in which there's a strong majority of people who have a certain religious conviction where default assumptions are okay, but in the countries I've described, people don't like that. Assuming people have a certain political party, subject to opt out. Everyone's a Republican in state X, unless they say otherwise. Republicans don't like that. It's because the goal is regarded as illegitimate. If the nudge is inconsistent with the values or interests of most choosers, people don't like it. So if you say that people are going to, by default, give money to a certain charity, they don't think that's in the interest of choosers. They don't want that. If you say that people are going to, there's going to be an educational campaign to encourage women to stay home, to take care of their kids if their kids are little. People don't like that. Across political lines, people don't like that. It's not consistent with people's values. So there's the illicit end, there's the values or interest inconsistency. If you surmount those two barriers, consistent with values and interests and legitimate ends, it's overwhelmingly likely that people are going to be upbeat about the nudge. The only qualification is there seems to be a category of manipulation which is very narrowly defined if we measure public opinion as the source. So the only one I've found that runs afoul of the anti-manipulation principle, let's say, is compulsory subliminal advertising in movie theaters to encourage people not to smoke and to eat healthy. I thought no one would want that. That seems intolerable, yes? Significant percentages of people in all the countries are for that, but not majorities. Majorities oppose that. Other things that seem to me to transgress the line into manipulation, like educational campaigns about obesity that are very tendentious and arguably offensive, majorities in America like that. I think because they think that the obesity problem's serious and maybe this will work. So the top line, to me, surprise, is overwhelming support in diverse nations for interventions of the kind that have been introduced or seriously considered, and indeed a desire for more.
That's very interesting. So what do you think, and there are a lot of people in this room whose job title is explicitly or implicitly about using behavioural science to improve public policy in various different countries. What do you think they should take away from your research about using public acceptability as a means to understanding the limitations of their work?
Well, okay, so one question is how you think about public acceptability. When I was in the government, I took orders from the president, and the basic goal of the executive branch is first to obey the law, and second, within the constraints of the law, to improve the well-being of the American people. So those are, in big block letters. Anything that would violate the law or reduce well-being, you don't do that. Public acceptability in a democratic society is also very important. So if you have something that would comply with the law, make people better off, but people would hate that, then that's very important to take into account. You're privileged to serve people. I think the lesson from the research is there's a lot of room to go that people will want to see and approve of, so long as the principles I described are not transgressed. So what I found from this research, and I confess I was expecting to get more negativity than I got, is a permission slip. Keeping in mind that if there's an intervention that is going to be inconsistent with people's values or their interests, they are going to holler. And then government should back off.
So to be controversial, no one's going to say they want to be taxed, right? And yet we think it's an appropriate thing for government to do on a kind of a net basis to tax people and redistribute income. How do we think about asking individuals about things that have quite widespread externalities?
Well, the nudges that I've described are basically harm to self nudges, not only, but basically. And those are the ones where the concern about paternalism and manipulation, I think, are especially intuitive. If you have something like an externality correcting tax on a good that's causing harm, or a criminal prohibition on wrongdoing, then you probably will have popular support for that. but the theory for doing it isn't the same and raises, if any flags, different kinds of flags. So one thing that's very helpful in your question is I think the book nudge could have been clearer in distinguishing between externality correcting nudges, which can be extremely helpful, and harm to self nudges, which also can be helpful. But the first, there's no question about paternalism or, I think, expansion of government's power. It's just introducing a new tool which may be complementary to the standard tools.
Right. So you've also been doing some research recently on perceptions by individuals of types of nudges, so using kind of the Kahneman System 1, System 2 theory. Can you tell us a little bit about what you found people like and don't like about different types of nudges?
Yes, so you can distinguish, I think, consistent with some of the ethical concerns you raise, between nudges that empower people's capacity for agency, like information about caloric content, or information about the advantages, let's say, of energy conservation in your home for you. That can make people better agents. And nudges that improve people's welfare if they're good, but they don't increase agency. So if people are automatically enrolled in a green energy program, their own agency isn't enhanced, though it may be justified. Graphic warnings are arguably going to improve welfare if they work well for cigarettes, but whether they increase people's capacity for agency, there's not an obvious yes to that question. Whether it makes them, more informed choosers, that's not, it maybe, but that's not entirely clear. Okay, so what we're basically finding in the United States is that people have a preference, majorities have a preference for educative System 2 nudges over non-educative System 1 nudges. It's not overwhelming. Something like roughly 55, 45%, 65, 35%. And what is unclear from the research is whether, from what I just told you in the research, is whether people think it's more respectful of people's dignity to increase people's capacity for agency, or whether they think instead that it's more likely to work. I also have interventions where people are told that the System 1 intervention is more effective, significantly more effective. Then what do you think? And it seems to be so far, there's something almost like an iron law that 10 to 14% of the population switches to favor the System 1 nudge, but some segment, 25 to 35%, sticks with the System 2 nudge. So I think what we're observing is heterogeneity with respect to people's evaluations, where some people are welfareists who will favor the System 2 nudge based on an intuitive judgment that it's going to be more effective, but they'll trade that off or switch once they see numbers. Some people are, kind of Kantians of a certain kind, or maybe just System 1 reactors who say, I want the educative one. You see, I phrased it in a way that was meant to both honor and query the System 1 preference. The honoring is to say they're Kantians. The System 1 nudge is more effective, so what? We want the agency promoting intervention. The alternative view is that they just have an immediate affective reaction, educate people. So you could think System 1 favors System 2 nudges. I wanted to call the article that, but the data is not inconsistent with it, but it doesn't confirm it. I believe it's true.
That does leave us with a slight sort of cognitive loop that we get caught in, does it not? I wanted to move on to something maybe a little closer to home. So can I get a show of hands of anyone here who has an Amazon Echo or similar kind of product in their home? Okay, so there are a few. For those of you who don't, it's a tech product, and Cass, correct me when I get this wrong because I don't have one, that listens to everything that you do in your home and can kind of respond to your voice. You can say, Amazon on, and please buy me so-and-so. One of the things that I was contemplating was, so Amazon will now know when I need toilet paper before I need toilet paper because I've gone, oh damn, we've just gotten to the last roll of toilet paper, and it says, oh, I will just add it to your shopping list. Some people feel creeped out. I personally feel a little creeped out by the idea of something listening to all of my conversations, despite the fact that it might give me a great deal of convenience in my life. Can you talk us through a little bit about why it is that people feel comfortable or uncomfortable with these things, and whether they differ by whether or not they're owned by Amazon or maybe a similar kind of device that the government can listen to?
Alexa is the name of my Amazon Echo, and I think all Amazon Echoes. I hope they didn't choose the name Alexa because they kind of know I like that name. If I don't know that I like that name, but maybe it figured it out. Alexa told me just the day before yesterday, I said, Alexa, as one does. Alexa, play music. And Alexa responded, here's music you'll like, and it's Santana. I hate Santana. What the question gets at is there's a pervasive choice that private and public institutions have among three options: having active choosing. Alexa, ask me what I'd like in the domain that you think it would be good to ask me about. That would be to combine defaults with active choosing. So active choosing, a mass default rule, which is the first generation, let's say, of behavioral economics, and personalized default rules. The beauty of the personalized default rules, whether it involves settings on your cell phone or your employer's plans for you, is that they have the accuracy that active choosing ideally will get you without the burdens that active choosers might not want to incur. And personalized default rules are just default rules. So guess how many seconds I heard Santana for? 2 seconds of Santana. So I could opt out of Santana. So that's the personalized defaults. So I think the next generation, we're going to see a lot of action in the domain of personalized defaults. And if it seems a little creepy in the abstract, as I think it does, you might consult aspects of your own experience over the last 6 months and witness domains in which you've been made really a lot better off because there's been some personalization for you. Now, there's the risks. One risk is that privacy will be invaded. So people should have full control over the extent of personalization, at least as a first approximation. They should be able to say, I don't want you acquiring that information if it's personally identifiable or holding it. So there's a privacy concern. There's also a concern in some domains, I think, and music and politics are too, of people through personalization being sorted into echo chambers that are in part of their own design, but in part designed by someone who knows them really, really well. And while on one theory of consumer sovereignty, that's fantastic, that's idealized, in a self-governing society, that's not so good. So you can contrast an architecture of control, which personalization instantiates, with an architecture of serendipity, which a democratic society provides a lot of room for. And the architecture of serendipity needs to be preserved. So there's that. On the government versus the private, I mean, one idea is that the market creates certain discipline against forms of personalization that are harmful. And there's a built-in constraint, market constraint, which the government doesn't have. And there's also a thought that the government has kind of unique powers of harm creation if it knows all this stuff about you. Now, in a well-functioning democracy, those unique powers are not likely to be exercised badly, but a well-functioning democracy partly defined by the fact that people are going to be worried that it's going to use those powers not well. So all those are completely fair concerns. I think we probably have to go domain by domain. I'll give you a context which I think puts a lot of this stuff in play. What about personalized voting? What about a default system that says, we know your voting patterns, you're for this person, and you don't even have to show up unless you say otherwise. I actually tested that both nationally and at Harvard. People don't like that. And it's because of their conception, I think, of the internal morality of voting. And the question is, to what does that generalize? Probably not to toilet paper. It is,
Good to know. Voting is very different from toilet paper. That is one thing that you have learnt in this session. So one thing that is probably worth bearing out, you've spent some time thinking about nudges since you wrote the book. What's one thing that was unexpected that's come from the book and the passage that we've all been on? And what's one thing you would like people to walk away from this conference taking back to their jobs?
I think the two least expected things to me, well, three. First is the immense scope and depth of the work in the last 8 years. So there's been an outpouring of creativity and knowledge creation that I think no one could have anticipated in 2007, 2008. So that's tribute to people in this room, and it's, I think in terms of both policy and knowledge, it's been truly revolutionary, and that doesn't happen very often. So that's number one. Number two is the existence of work that uses behavioral insights to think about, let's say, choice eliminating approaches. Thaler and I are both, strongly in favor of choice preserving approaches, but I think it must be said that there's been some excellent work suggesting that, by analogy to Social Security, and not only, but definitely in the area of externality creation. One area is fuel economy and energy efficiency, where the internality literature is, I think, not resolved yet, but it's at least suggesting, as the US government believes, that internalities justify mandates, so long as there's a lot of consumer freedom retained, but mandates that go beyond what the market is doing. That's extremely interesting, and I didn't anticipate that. The third thing is shout out to Scarcity by Eldar and Sendel, which I think is a massively important book, and the emphasis on limited bandwidth and the connection between limited bandwidth and behaviorally informed tools. We're learning more and more about that all the time and how to apply that to development. It's so important. And so you can maybe draw a line. People know the name of Kahneman's first book? It's the perfect name, Attention and Effort. It's all about, that's not a false description of the book. That's what it's about. And you can draw a line from attention and effort to some of the stuff on nudging to scarcity. And scarcity is, I think, opening up a whole new unanticipated avenue for thought and practice.
Very much agree. Well, I'm going to open it up to questions from the floor. So if you'd like to put your hand up if you've got a question for Cass. He's already answered the question on voting being different than toilet paper, so that's probably not worth raising again. Anybody? Yeah, the back.
I could just talk. What do you think about personalized defaults and whether people feel as though, do you think people would be more or less concerned about the legitimacy of personalized defaults as opposed to one-size-fits-all defaults?
Depends on the domain, doesn't it? So to have your employer saying that you're 35 years old, here's what your default retirement plan is going to look like. It would not look like that if you were 55 years old. I think no one is alarmed by that. To have a personalized set of recommendations from the government about what you should be doing about something, given your own goals, no one really objects to that. So the question is, why would people object to personalization? If the government gets it wrong, that's a problem. If the government knows something that you don't want the government to know, that's a problem. And I think it's a problem if the government is making you into a kind of tighter and tighter version of who you already are, rather than introducing serendipity and expansion. In terms of I think the objection to personalization as a matter of public opinion, and I have a lot of data on this, it's not as clear as I expected, the objection to personalization, but to the extent that it exists, it's probably a heuristic, which is knowing stuff about me personally is bad. And like most heuristics, that's generally good, but it misfires. So if some website that you interact with a lot, let's say it's your travel website, it knows your preferences, that's not something to be alarmed about. So the public opinion objection sometimes points to a legitimate and really important privacy interest, but sometimes it might be a kind of system one creeped out reaction, which on the ground in the case isn't warranted.
I think we've got a question from Twitter. Thanks, Abby.
Julia Featherston asks, what nudges did you fully expect to work that are in fact not effective?
I'm so glad that's a hard question. I'll tell you the ones that I expected to be more effective than they appear to be involve some information disclosure ones. Now, whether they're ineffective or just we don't know yet is a good question. But there isn't a lot of powerful evidence that the energy efficiency labels are having a big impact on consumer choices. Now, the absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence, but there's a book that's rhetorically on fire that is very skeptical about information disclosure. And there's some truth in putting a burden of justification on people with respect to information disclosures that may be like background noise.
Yeah, up the front here.
You spoke earlier about the need to preserve serendipity in forums where people are forming opinions and so on. Any ideas on how to do that?
Well, here's a fantastic book. One of the great books, I think, of the last 100 years. Jane Jacobs' The Death and Life of the Great American Cities. And it's like a prose poem. And what she's saying is in a great city like Berlin or London or New York or small blocks, you go around the corner and what you see or who you see, who would have thought? And a daily newspaper, when things are working well, is exactly like what Jacobs is talking about. You see some story about some problem, let's say in Paris, or about refugees, and it attracts your attention, changes what you do that month, maybe even changes your life. And probably everyone in the room has had at least one incident where that's happened. Thaler and I reviewed Moneyball. And I don't know how Thaler came across it. He happened to mention it to me at lunch. And I don't know how Michael Lewis got into writing that fantastic book, but I bet there was some serendipity there. So, there's an idea of how to create search engines so as to promote at least a degree of serendipity rather than total control. And this is something technology can move us toward. It can create the equivalent of a great city on a website. And that's a continuing challenge. I know some of the work on terrorism is actually related to this, where there's a view which has evidence behind it that many terrorists live in communities where they are just hearing stuff all the time, and it's kind of architected by people who don't have benign goals. And the people who end up caught up in the echo chambers, they aren't born killers. They're not stupid. They're not poorly educated. They're just responding to what they hear. So I know Prime Minister Cameron delivered, I think, a very powerful speech pointing out the risks of self-insulation. And here we're not talking about minor risks like too much food intake. This is about killing people.
At the front here.
Hi. Learning with experience is not easy, yet we seem to find it worth it. Do you think that choice architecture could make it even harder in the sense that, we get nudged around too often and then we have even less of a chance to learn from experience? Okay, so I'll give you a frivolous answer and then a less frivolous one. But the frivolous answer has a point. The time when choice architecture makes it so that people aren't learning
but are just being defaulted into this, defaulted into that. That's a time that you could imagine being depicted in a science fiction story, but it's not humanly imaginable. So suppose there was a government in a democratic nation who went, much bigger on nudging than any nation has. The notion that the citizens of that nation would not be learning, and I think that's not realistic. For one thing, some of the things that nation would be doing would be educative, learning-focused nudging. And if they have some default rules, like you're automatically in green energy, you're automatically got a double-sided printing machine, you've got a double-sided, anything that involves paper is going to be double-sided, you're automatically in a savings plan, that society's not going to squelch learning. It might even free up space for learning in domains that really matter to people, because they don't have to worry about, right, so there's that. But that's kind of a frivolous answer. I think the less frivolous answer is that it is true that there are areas in which it's very important to increase people's capacity for making decisions for themselves. And if you have a nudge that doesn't do that and does the opposite, that might be a cost, or at least not conferring a benefit. So I'll coin a term, the GPSification of life. That's the problem you're pointing to. So because of the GPS, a lot of people don't know how to navigate roads who otherwise would. They don't learn. That's not an argument against having a GPS, but it is a cost of having a GPS. So Ralph Hertwig in Germany has done some, I think, very strong work on agency promoting interventions. He calls them boosts. I would call them educative nudges. That doesn't matter at all. But they do have the advantage of promoting learning. I think we need something like a decision cost, error cost analysis of when a learning-focused intervention is preferable to one that doesn't get you to learn. And the stuff on System 1 and System 2 nudges, I think, is picking up on when that really matters.
Yeah, and the white up the back there.
Throughout the conference, I've heard lots of examples of people misunderstanding nudges. So either giving an example of a nudge that probably isn't really actually what a nudge is, or also misunderstanding the limitations of nudges. How would you suggest that the people in this room could help clarify those misunderstandings?
Okay, so the first one on the definition, everyone's entitled to his or her own of a term that doesn't have a canonical definition, but I think it's orderly to say a nudge is an intervention that preserves freedom of choice, but also steers people in a particular direction that they can reject. So a GPS is a defining example of a nudge, a warning is a nudge, a reminder, social norms are nudges. So does that help? So it's very simple. Preserve freedom of choice, don't impose material costs, and steer. What was the second? The second one was?
How can we help people to?
Oh, the other part was limitations of nudges.
Okay, so public opinion has an implicit philosophy in it, which seems to me pretty good, which is there are ethical limitations, and we describe those. If you have significant externalities, then the choice-preserving approaches might be complementary, and under really great conditions, they might be sufficient. But it would be surprising if they did everything that needed to be done.
Yeah.
Hi, Cass. Since it's the election season, I was just wondering if you can comment whether or not you see the rise of nudging in competitive elections, getting voters turnout, getting voters to get angry with the other party or something like that. It's actually useful in improving the agencies of voters, or it is just not a good development? Thanks.
Let's do a little experiment here. Maybe just think it in your mind. Don't raise your hand, but I'm going to ask a few questions. How many of you are going to vote in 2016? Just think it in your mind in whatever country you live in. Now, I'm going to ask you another question. Do you know where you're going to vote? Do you have a sense of how to get there? Now I'm going to ask you a third question. How many of you are going to buy a car in 2016? You know where you're going to go to buy a car? Those of you who are going to buy a car in 2016? Okay, what just happened, probably, is the percentage of people who are going to vote in 2016 in this room increased a little bit. And the percentage of people in this room who are going to buy cars in 2016 increased a little bit. So to ask people if they're going to vote, Todd Rogers has done great work on this, increases voting. To ask people if they know how to get to where they're going to vote, that increases voting. And to ask people if they're going to buy something where that something is X, increases the likelihood they're going to buy it. And it's related to the attention and effort point. So that's a long-winded way of saying absolutely. There have been campaigns that have used behavioral techniques to good effect in get out the vote efforts. And there are many things you can do. Ted Cruz used a social norm approach in a very aggressive way in one of the primaries. And social norm approaches, you get a letter saying everybody in your community pretty much is voting, but you didn't last time. Probably the likelihood that you vote is going to increase. So there's a toolbox of behaviorally informed strategies for voting.
Yep. Final question.
Thanks. So there's a lot of questions, or like a lot of discussion around nudges being used in a way that just generally increases welfare. But I was wondering if you thought much about the way in which choice architecture seems intuitive, to me at least, to be pretty good for people in wealthy backgrounds and pretty bad often from people from disadvantaged backgrounds. And it's not something that really takes up conversation in these kind of conferences. I'm just wondering if you had any thoughts on what kind of direction we could go in to kind of address that problem.
That's great. So thank you for that. Esther Duflo has some oral remarks saying something roughly like this. Stop berating people for not taking responsibility for their own lives and start thinking instead of the extent to which people who are well off don't have to take care of responsibility because things are taken care for them. If they do nothing, people who are well off, they're on the right track. If people in difficult conditions do nothing, they are on the wrong track. I think that's a profound point about choice architecture. I mean, most people in this room, we don't have to worry about whether the water is clean, about whether the air is bad, whether we're going to get mugged when we go out on the street, whether if we get sick, how to get to a doctor, whether the doctor is going to be a real doctor. We don't have to worry about any of that stuff. And so that's completely true, that choice architecture for people under desperate conditions is part of what it means to live under desperate conditions. And if there's one thing that the people in this room, I think, could devote attention to in the next decade, a strong candidate would be not deploy kind of top-down behavioral insights, but to think of concrete areas where things aren't going well for people. And you put your finger on the area where maybe that's most insistently a problem, and what can be done to be helpful.
And on that note, can you all join me in thanking Cass Sunstein?